peace that surpasses all understanding. Uh, my story, my story, my experience, my truth. Um, Going from a state of victim to survivor to thriver. And I do feel that some people, a lot of people, get stuck in that survival. I'm a survivor mentality. Um, Equally, I found the victim and survivor stance to be equally dissatisfying. It was only once I started to live from a point of my own integrity and my own character. Who is Scott, if not for all the abuse? I choose to live there now. But if you're here and you clicked on the button, welcome, welcome. I admire the courage that it takes, um, coming through my own experiences, and the courage that it takes to click on that button. And you're welcome here, and this is a safe place. I'm proud of you. I am. Um, there's a common theme when we have ideas of a man or a boy or a male being abused, that automatically our thought process seems to be driven. Well, his abuser must have been a male. That's not always the case. Um, that's not always the case. My abuser was my biological mother, my blood mother. Um, and some of my earliest memories are based in abuse. The abuse was sexual in nature, very violent, very violent. Um, and there's another misconception that um, through the course of my processing, healing, um, counseling, therapy, um, et cetera, group counseling. There is that there's a common misconception that when we think of uh, rape or sexual abuse, that it is a sexual act. It's not. It's an act of violence, control, manipulation, um, lording over someone, having control over someone through, and it's violence. It's violence. It's taking something by force that doesn't, without consent. It's violence. It's not sex, and that was a huge obstacle to overcome in my process, because it affected me in later years, um, how I perceived sex. Um, so to get right into it, what kind of abuse are we talking about, Scott? And it's sensitive material, guys and gals. Um, Everybody's welcome here. It's sensitive material, and but to stand in my own integrity and claim my experiences and claim my truth and to share how I went through the process of victim, survivor, and achieving some level that I'm comfortable with, thriving in my life after having those experiences. Um, the you know yeah, jump right into it. Um, the sexualized violence that I experienced was via oral sex. And being being a child, when you consider the anatomy, the physical anatomy of a child, very small, small hands, small arms. Um, there would be penetration with my arms and hands. Um, Again, forced to perform oral sex. Um, and the more, shall we say, violent experiences that I had, beatings were commonplace. And we have this, you know, I would see friends have where they were, friends or kids in the neighborhood where mom and dad would spank them to get their attention. I'm not talking about physical discipline. I'm talking about beatings, being picked up, thrown across a room. Um, there was another particular occasion where I was burned with a hot spatula over the flame, and there was that. Um, the object, we have an image perhaps of being beaten with a belt or whatever. In my house, my particular, if we think of a wiffle ball, a plastic bat and plastic ball. There was a there was a certain variety of wiffle bat, long, slender, yellow wiffle bat, and it had electrical tape wrapped around it to give it some weight and some density. And that was another um, that was another situation. The beatings would involve that bat or whatever she could lay her hands on, or her hands. Um, but the and that's a good one. Here you go. To give you an example or an idea of the mindset of the abuser, when she didn't have something handy, um, whatever, and she would strike me with her hand, um, she would blame me for hurting her hand. Look what you made, my hand, that hurt and it's your fault, placing all the blame on the victim. Um, that type of thing. Look what you made me do. And before we go any further, I want to address something. And it kind of goes to the healing aspect. I'm just on flow here. I don't have a script and I didn't take notes. We're just on flow. Um, but considering my mother, okay, and where I found my healing and that spirit of thriving was through forgiveness. And part of forgiveness is understanding and coming to an understanding of what my mother experienced in her lifetime and the trauma that she experienced. And with all respect, I would liken it to in regards to her, you kick a dog and kick a dog and kick a dog, and then get angry at the dog when it bites you. And that would be a fair analogy. My mother didn't have a chance when she was a young girl growing up, and her abuser was her father. And in later years, not my father. She was married once before. Um, she was married once before, and her first husband, prior to my father, was extraordinarily abusive. And so, anyway, to gain a certain sense of understanding and even compassion and empathy for the person, um, to have an understanding of why they did and why they behaved the way they did, it gives you some clarity. Not an easy process because when you're in a victim stance, it's not convenient or easy to perceive your abuser as a damaged, traumatized person as well. But there is a lot of understanding and healing that can occur when we can get out of our own victim mentality or survivor mentality and to see our abuser as a fellow traveler. They had their own experience, and they reacted to their experience in a not so nice way. But moving on, the other similar or familiar things that I would experience, or ongoing things that I would experience as a child, bath time and bedtime were very frightening, terrifying times for me. Um, uh, these were things that happened on a frequently reoccurring basis. If I was in the bathtub, um, I would have my feet pulled out from under me, hand put on my chest, and I'd be held underwater until I lost consciousness. And either through pain or cold water, she would dump cold water on me to revive me, or slap me. But sternal rub, if you try that on yourself, your sternum is very sensitive. If you make a knuckle and just push on that a little bit, you'll see what I mean. So in the bathtub, and that happened on numerous occasions, numerous. Um, so much so that I would avoid bathing until I got to school. Um, Nap time or sleeping time when I was in bed, I would be smothered with a pillow or have my she would put her hand over my mouth and until I lost consciousness, and again she would revive me. Um, Numerous and completely out of the blue beatings. Like, well, what the heck was that for? I didn't, learning the patterns of my abuser, um, learning their emotional states, um, in order to predict and protect myself. I found a great deal of solace and peace and comfort in the darkness and solitude of my closet. I actually preferred to sleep in my closet rather than my bed for obvious reasons. But at the time, I didn't realize what I was doing when I'd go into the darkness of my closet. I was meditating. As an adult, I look back and I remember those experiences, and how they played out. I was meditating. You know, Wonderful thing. These perspectives or perceptions of events. And um, anyway, moving on. Um, my grandmother, my biological grandmother, my mother's mother, came to the awareness of what was going on after an incident involving my mother. And now, you know, my mother ended up opening up a daycare within our house, and there was abuse there. The kids, myself included, we would be forced to perform sexual acts on one another for my mother's gratification, and ultimate. And I don't know. I'm not sure the timeline, like how long, doesn't matter. But sure enough, man, one of the kids, went home to mommy and daddy with a story of what was going on in daycare. And shortly after that, there was the law got involved and what have you. And my grandmother, my biological grandmother, found out what was going on in the household. She had some suspicions prior to that, but this um, brought it home, and she ended up pulling me out of my house with my mother, and I ended up living with my grandmother and my grandfather. And what a wonderful woman for her to show up in my life. Um, Amazing, amazing. Um, we're talking, by that time I was my father. I'll give you another example. While there was no actual arrest made, my father died in 1976, and it was widely held within the family and through the legal system. My mother was investigated for his death. Um, he had some cardiac issues, and she was dosing him his meds, and there was some question. And I remember detectives coming to the house interviewing. I remember there was court and there was hearings, and even as a little kid, I knew there was something going on. There was something sketchy going on. All directed the investigation of my mother and her possible involvement in overdosing my father and him ultimately um, having a heart attack, losing consciousness, falling off of a scaffolding at work, and breaking his neck. He landed on his head. So, to give you that example, and again, while there was ultimately no charges pressed, no jail time, it was widely held that my mother had something to do uh, directly with my father's death. Um, but anyway, so this would have been 1976, 1977. And my grandmother, after this child care incident, pulled me out of the house and I went to live with my grandparents. And what a wonderful experience that was. There was the way my life had been and the example of what can life be like, to have the example of my grandmother and her heart, um, and her love and her understanding and her compassion and her tenderness and her direction and her example in the relationship that she had with my grandfather of what my life had been and what it could be. Um, and I stayed with my grandmother, and it was a wonderful experience to have that contrast, of what a loving home is. However, being my grandmother, she was older, in getting on in years, and from the time I was about 7, 8, 9 till 15, I lived with my grandmother, and sadly, she was diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's, whatever, and she was no longer able to care for me. And once she was admitted to a nursing home, a rehab center, there was no place for me to go except back home. And within very short time, and I do mean very short, of going back home and being with my biological mother, being 15, I was a minor. Um, and in those days, there wasn't the legal system and the child protective services that we have nowadays. So I ended up going back home in my mother's house, and within very short time, I'm going to say probably the first week or two, there was yet another incident where I'm 15 now. I'm 15. I was a young strapping lad, and I woke to her attempting to fondle me and masturbate on my bedside, and um, I, I was not gonna go there. I was done. I was done, and that particular event, um, I woke violently, and by the end of, it was very very quick. You ever, excuse my language, but this was the experience, jumping out of bed and basically beating my mother within an inch of her life. And I do recall having my hands around her neck up against the wall. If you ever touch me again, I will fucking kill you. And I was serious. Um, that was the experience. To which her reaction was, "This is my house. You don't like it, get out." And I did. Packed up, and I do remember. literally, quite literally, I had a pillowcase. Threw my shit in a pillowcase. I'm out of here. Fuck you. See you later. Um, pardon the vulgarity, but it lends itself to the story. This is what happened. This wasn't my imagination. And I ended up on the street, in on the street, homeless, literally homeless, for about 2 weeks. I ended up moving in with my friend at the time. Um, I ended up moving in with him and his mother and sister and family, to have a place to live. But where that led me, where my abuse and trauma led me, um, even after having the example of loving compassion from my grandmother, um, I was on my own, and a 15-year-old boy coming from a traumatic background, having the good fortune to have a place to go, my friend's house, and having the good fortune of my experience with my grandparents, and from that point on, I was in survival mode. So I did anything I had to do to survive and support myself. And I think what I'll do is I'm gonna, I don't think I'm gonna be able to. My time capture is only about 30 minutes, and we're already 20 minutes. And I think what I'll do is I'll do this in stages. So this will be part one of victim, survivor, thriver. My story and trauma, my story of trauma. I'm no longer in it. But we'll do it that way. I'll do it in increments. So with that, I'll sign off, and I'll head toward part two.